So, recently Japan's Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba resigned after losing 2 elections. His party, the LDP, then voted in a new leader, the more rightward-leaning Sanae Takaichi. As a result of them choosing Sanae Takaichi and a couple of other factors, their coalition partner, Komeito, a sort of centrist Buddhist party, left government and left the coalition, which meant that the LDP had to go out hunting and shopping for a new coalition partner. After a bit of back and forth, the LDP then managed to make an agreement with fellow Conservative party Ishin, who became their new coalition partner and joined government with them. Now, you might well be wondering at this point what any of this has to do with the royal family or imperial succession within Japan. Well, when Ishin agreed to join this coalition with the LDP, they had a list of 12 or so demands, and among those was a demand relating to the royal family. One of these requests was said to be a change to imperial succession law. Now, the change they had in mind was to change the succession laws within Japan to allow the current royal family, which has a bit of a shortage of male heirs, to adopt new male heirs, adopt them into the current family from the former imperial family. Now, why would they ask for such a thing? Well, essentially, Japan's current royal family has a bit of a succession crisis at the moment. Ultimately, they only have one male heir who's gone through an adulthood ceremony in the last 40 years or so, so it's very much hanging on one eventual male successor, Prince Hisahito, which puts a lot of pressure on his shoulders. Now, to address this situation, they could either allow women potentially to succeed to Japan's Chrysanthemum Throne, but that possibly upsets traditionalists. Another possibility is that there's a set of descendants from sort of further back in Japan's imperial family, its royal family tree, who were cut off from the succession in 1947. These were sort of cadet branches descended from other emperors who were always considered part, traditionally, of the royal family and eligible at some point for succession. But the American government, when they came in the 1940s, essentially trimmed the aristocracy of Japan, and that included cutting these sort of cadet alternative branches and potential alternative successors to the royal family out, and to no longer consider them successors. But now there's so few male heirs that it's seen as a potentially attractive solution to Japan's current problem to adopt them back in, say to have a senior member of Japan's current royal family adopt them as a son or nominally, and say they're now back in the royal family, they're back in the chain of succession, just to take the pressure off the current heirs and to add additional male heirs. This would simultaneously be acceptable for traditionalists who only want the unbroken chain of male succession in Japan, which goes back to the very early history of Japan. That would allow that tradition to continue, which arguably is where a lot of Japan's royal family get their legitimacy from, but also simultaneously strengthens the royal family and removes the very real prospect of it potentially having no more heirs at some point in the near future. Now, at this point, it might be worth tempering your expectation, because although this is something Ishin requested in order to join government with the LDP, it's considered among their list of demands, reportedly. It might not necessarily be their very top priority. For example, 2 requests they've made, which have sort of been more widely reported on by the media, and therefore you might consider potentially to be more top priorities for Ishin, are campaign finance reform and reform to how political contributions are made, and reform to the number of MPs or members of Japan's Diet to restrict the number of politicians in Japan. Those 2 demands they've made of the LDP have much more been widely publicised, and so you could argue that potentially they're a higher priority for Ishin as opposed to reforming Japan's succession law. Nonetheless, it still is very much on the list of demands reportedly that they made to the LDP, but there is perhaps a danger that if it's not at the very top of the list, that it might take time to get this through, and they could perhaps be waylaid with other political issues, or that they might not get around to it by the time there's another election in Japan, or there's some other crisis that prevents them getting through it in the current parliament. However, aside from the fact that Ishin demanded it as a precondition for joining in government with the LDP, there are reasons to believe this could very well realistically happen. The main reason to expect this to be a realistic prospect is that Sanae Takaichi, the new Prime Minister of Japan, who's of course taken Ishin into government with her, is very much a traditionalist. She said many times that she favours continuing the tradition of male-only succession within the Japanese royal family. So it might well be that she personally might be aligned to this sort of solution, given that she's generally believed to be favourable to maintaining this tradition of male-only succession, and presumably she would be in favour of securing the royal family and adding additional successors to maintain its stability, you might imagine she might well consider that a priority. She might be amenable to such a solution, and so she might not be against this solution that's being proposed by Ishin. It just remains to be seen at this point how high a priority for Sanae Takaichi and Ishin it is, and just how soon they'll get around to this. But there's every reason to think that this could happen at some point in the near future.